you know, thank you. Thank you. So I have to say that every public speaker prays for weather that is just good enough to induce people to leave their homes and just bad enough not to be able to have picnics outside. So my prayer was not answered on the weather front, but I must say I admire the discipline of you liberal Protestants, because you sign up for something and you come, whether or not you want to, at 4 o'clock on this really beautiful Sunday. So my great hope is to make this as worth it as possible for a possible lost picnic. So let me start about 9 months ago, week 4 of the 2014 NFL season. Monday night, beginning of the fourth quarter, Kansas City defensive back Hussein Abdullah picks off New England Patriots quarterback Tom Brady, runs it back for a touchdown, slides into Sijda al-Shukr, the prayer of thanksgiving in Islam. Ref pulls a yellow flag and gives him 15 yards for excessive celebration. So there is, interestingly, a prayer exception to excessive celebration, which is why Tim Tebow never got flagged. So which I think makes sense, right? I don't think you ought to. I think excessive celebration is, unbecoming, and I think that prayer is a good thing. Why did Tim Tebow never get flagged and Hussein Abdullah got flagged? So I don't think that this was a moment of overt religious bigotry. I just think that the ref didn't know what Muslim prayer looked like. Right? But what struck me about that moment are the unlikely places and the unlikely professions where religious diversity is making an impact. I mean, who knew that as part of the training of NFL referees, you ought to know what different religious practices look like? The next day, the NFL released a statement that said that the ref was wrong to pull that flag. And I promise you, this year's NFL refs, as part of their training, which they're probably going through right now as we just had draft days, religious diversity in some way, shape, or form, the various prayer practices and public expressions of religious traditions is probably a part of that training. The unlikely places where religious diversity is making its presence felt in the United States of America. A couple of other interesting examples. So, anybody in here familiar with a book called The Spirit Catches You and You Fall Down? Okay, wonderful book. The premise of the book is a Hmong family. The Hmong are a mountain people from Cambodia, Laos, Thailand, Vietnam. Perhaps they're familiar to you in the context of news of the Vietnam War. They were a community of people that was helpful to the United States' efforts in Indochina, and as part of reciprocity for that help, the United States helped resettle quite a number of them. And a small community emerges in Merced, California. And one of these families, their 1-year-old daughter begins to have seizures. And they take her to a hospital, and the doctors, I think that the technical medical term for this, freak out. 1-year-old, that's all right, y'all can laugh at that. And I know this is a seminary and all, but 1-year-old girl having seizures, right? And in some ways, the family doesn't quite understand. They have a sense that something serious is happening, of course, but a sense that something significant can be happening also. The Hmong have a faith tradition called Shamanism, and as a piece of their shaman spiritual worldview, they believe that a young person having a seizure may well be a sign of her spirit being captured and perhaps being replaced with the spirit of a shaman. In other words, a seizure is not only a moment for serious medical attention, it is also perhaps a moment of spiritual grace. This entire book is basically the parallel journeys of this Hmong shaman family and these medical practitioners who simply could not communicate because of this vast gulf in spiritual worldview. There are some tragic moments in this. One in which the doctors are so frustrated that the parents are not giving their daughter the medicine the doctors are prescribing, that they call DCFS and have a half dozen police officers show up on the front porch of this Hmong family who do not speak English and take this girl away for 6 months. And of course, from the perspective of a Western medical doctor, the notion of not giving your 1.5-year-old daughter medication for a seizure seems like absolute absentia in being a parent. But from the perspective of the Hmong shaman parents, they couldn't understand why the doctors kept changing the dosage. Now, those of us who go to Western hospitals, we understand that doctors change things. They're constantly experimenting with the exact right cocktail, etc. But from the perspective of these parents, they were thinking to themselves, not only are you not acknowledging something spiritually special might be happening, but it doesn't appear to us that you know what you're doing, because you keep on telling us, go to the drugstore to get this, and then the next week it's go to the drugstore and get this and this and this. One week it's give it to her 3 times, the next week it's give it to her 6 times. Massive gulf in understanding. A gulf which incidentally, like the Hussein Abdullah situation, cannot, I don't think, simply be categorized in the generic term multiculturalism. One has to engage the religious dimensions of this. As comfortable as it might be, especially for progressives, and I count myself as one of those, this is not simply a generic cultural difference. It is one grounded in something very, very specific. It is a religious issue. Let me give you a third brief example. A couple of months ago, when a Chinese police officer was tragically gunned down in the New York Police Department, the department realized it had no idea what to do when it came to a Buddhist funeral. There are no small number of Roman Catholic church services that take place in the passing of a police officer in the New York Police Department. And people know what to do when they go to a church, when there's a wake in the Roman Catholic tradition, when there's visitations and the like. But no idea what to do in the intimate silence of a Buddhist ceremony. If you are a doctor or a nurse in a hospital, if you are a chaplain or an officer or an administrator in a police department, heck, if you're an NFL ref or a coach at any level, religious diversity is likely going to make its presence felt. And you probably have to have some fluency in it. That, of course, is the theme of these last several weeks of these talks that you have attended, and it's, of course, the theme of my talk. Diana Eck, who is somebody that we intellectually follow at Interfaith Youth Core, she's kind of lovingly called, she and the Pluralism Project, the mothership of so much of the civic interfaith work that's taking place in the early 21st century. She played a huge role in my own development. In the late 1990s, when I was just starting to form Interfaith Youth Core, I happened to be in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and I shot Professor Eck an email, and I said, I want to tell you about this new organization. I'm starting Interfaith Youth Core. And she had me to the back of the home that she and her partner, Dorothy, tend to for tea. And we talked for hours and hours about this new organization that I was just forming. And at that time, I was thinking to myself, how lucky am I? My previous conversations about Interfaith Youth Core had taken place amongst the 9 voices in my head. And now I get to talk to literally the nation, perhaps the world's leading expert in American religious diversity about the topic. One of the things that Professor X says that rings in my head still is America is very likely the most religiously diverse nation in human history. I mean, that's a stunning fact, right? More people from more different religious communities have gathered in this political entity than in any other political entity in any other time in human history. And if you think about it, it makes sense. You know, America of immigrant nation fame, and all of these different immigrants, some who come willingly, and of course, many, many who come unwillingly. the tapestry of those various religious beliefs and expressions is laid on top of a tapestry of very rich native religious belief and expression. That combination of indigenous religious traditions, which are multiple in nature, and the religious traditions that come from the four corners of the earth would make this the most religiously diverse country in human history. I have an interesting story of that in Louisville. So I think this is when I actually came for the Guarmire 6 years ago, this happens to me. So I get in a taxi from the airport, and the driver says to me, "Where are you from?" And I say, "Chicago, but before that, India." And I say, "Where are you from?" And he says, "Mauritania." And I say, "Oh, one of my spiritual mentors studied Islam in Mauritania." And this is kind of an offhanded back of the taxi cab conversation. And I paused for a couple beats, and I just kind of mentioned, without even thinking about it, Sheikh Hamza Youssef. And the taxi cab driver almost has an accident and pulls the car to the side of the road, looks back at me and says, "God loves Sheikh Hamza." Right? And it turns out that Sheikh Hamza Youssef is probably the best known Muslim cleric in North America today. Studied a couple of villages away from where this guy grew up. And I'm not sure if you know this. When I mentioned that story to Sheikh Hamza, he says, "Well, it's, Louisville has this relatively large collection of Mauritanian Muslims," right? So who knew, right? Who knew that this group of Mauritanian Muslims, the West African country in which America's most famous white convert cleric, born Mark Hansen, where he studied, right? Your city, your cab drivers, most religiously diverse nation in human history, most religiously devout nation in the Western Hemisphere. What does that mean? That means, well, just on the data of this, our rates of prayer before meals, of attendance at church, synagogue, mosque, temple, of believing in God, they are multiples of the rates in our sister countries in Europe. Interestingly, even America's atheists and agnostics say they believe in something higher than them, right? And it sounds like a joke, but the data shows that it's the truth. People in Italy, in France, in Britain, in Australia, their rates of going to church, 10 to 20% of the population a week. Here, 40 to 50% at least report that they're going to church a week, right? That's why G.K. Chesterton famously says that America is a nation with the soul of a church. Now, my own sense is that that's a true but incomplete line. We're a nation with the soul of a church, a synagogue, a gurdwara, a mosque, a sangha, a secular humanist society. But the fact remains, the most religiously diverse and most religiously devout, at least in the Western Hemisphere, at a time of global religious conflict, crisis, and tension. So, if you open the New York Times on any given day and you flip through and you cut out the articles in the newspaper that have something to do with religious tensions somewhere in the world, whether it's the proxy war between Saudi Arabia and Iran in Yemen, or whether it's continuing Sunni Shia violence in Pakistan, or whether it's the still kind of cold war between Catholics and Protestants in Belfast, cut those articles out and see how much newspaper you have left. And then think about this. What does America's religious diversity mean? It means that diaspora groups of all of those communities live here in Boston, in Houston, in Chicago, in Seattle, in Louisville. All of those communities fighting elsewhere live cheek by jowl in the United States of America. That's what religious diversity means, right? What does religious devotion mean? It means, at some level, religion matters. America's religious diversity and our religious devotion in a time of global religious conflict, crisis, and tension is not necessarily a good thing. This is something else we get from Diana Eck. She, of course, as I'm sure she shared with you, defines diversity in a very straight way. She says diversity is just a fact. It's just the sociological, demographic fact of people who orient around religion differently, living in close quarters with each other. That's all it is. Nothing more than that. It's not an achievement. It's nothing to be celebrated quite yet. Religious diversity can just as easily become conflict as it can become cooperation. People sometimes like to think of diversity as interesting ethnic foods, right? Egg rolls and samosas, and may your palate be wide enough to enjoy both. But when you read about the religious conflict in the New York Times, that's religious diversity too. So, most religiously diverse nation in human history, most religiously devout nation in the Western Hemisphere at a time of global religious conflict, crisis, and tension, meaning that those groups fighting over there, diaspora segments, live here. What are the implications? I think religious diversity in the United States can basically become one of four things, only one of which, by the way, is good. The first is a bunker of isolation. People can very easily say, I want nothing to do with you. I'm going to take the resources of my tradition and wall myself off from the rest of you. There are groups, you know them well, that do that. The second thing religious diversity can become is a barrier of division. What distinguishes barrier from bunker? Well, people who build bunkers generally don't pay too much attention to the folks outside. They're not spending that much energy either lauding or denouncing them. But people who build barriers not only want to wall themselves off, but they want to denounce folks on the other side of the wall. The Amish build bunkers. They're not that interested in denouncing the outside world. They're very interested in staying within their own world. There's other folks who build barriers. The folks that were shouting in my ear on the way to Derby yesterday. Very interested in building barriers, denouncing folks on the other side of the wall. The third thing, bludgeons of domination. That's what we read about every day in the New York Times. The people who will take their faith identity and use it to smash those who are different. And the fourth is a bridge of cooperation. Religious diversity can become one of four things: bunkers of isolation, barriers of division, bludgeons of domination, bridges of cooperation. One of the interesting things about these four, other than the fact that they all start with B, which, by the way, I worked very hard on. Thank you very much. In 15 years, this might be my single best idea, so pay attention, hold on. Is the same material that builds a bridge can build a bunker. The same material that builds a bridge can build a barrier. The same material that builds a bridge can be a bludgeon. Use whatever material you want in your mind, whether it's a brick or a stone. But the way the metaphor works is that you can use the knowledge of your religion as something that builds a bunker of isolation or a bridge of cooperation. You can use history as something that builds a barrier of division or a bludgeon of domination. You can use knowledge of somebody else's tradition as something that builds a barrier of division or a bridge of cooperation. The same type of knowledge can be used to build any one of these structures. I'll get into this a little bit more later. But the first thing I want to do is to tell you why bridges are good. This is the sociologist in me that is unwilling to accept a metaphor, however beautiful, however poetic the image, as positive on face value. Why are bridges of cooperation necessary for a religiously diverse society? I'm going to give you 5 reasons, but only 4 right now. I'm going to give you the 5th at the end of the talk, so that should you find yourself nodding off in a couple of minutes, you will have something to keep you awake for about 20 minutes from now. So here are the first 4 reasons that bridges of cooperation are a good thing for a religiously diverse civil society. Reason number 1, they reduce prejudice, right? in a diverse society, it is a bad thing for certain identity groups to experience prejudice. It's bad because it's a violation of their dignity, whether they are African American or Native American or Muslim American or Jewish American. It is a violation of the dignity of an individual or an identity group to experience prejudice. But the second reason that they're bad is it is a barrier to their contribution, right? And any civil society, any economy, any nation, particularly a democracy, relies on the participation and contributions of its citizens and members. Prejudice serves not only as a violation of dignity, but as a barrier to contribution. Why wouldn't a democracy, an economy, a civil society want all of its citizens to be able to start businesses and nonprofit organizations and arts projects and youth development projects? That's how a whole society thrives. A society is not achieving its potential if particular groups have barriers to their contribution. One of the positive things about bridges of interfaith cooperation is they reduce those barriers. They reduce the prejudice. Number two, social cohesion. This is a fancy term that social scientists like to use for the positive benefits of relationships between different groups. Those benefits go beyond just the reduction of prejudice. Social scientists like to talk about lubrication between a variety of groups in a diverse civil society. It is possible to imagine a diverse society as a place where you have effectively people from different communities living parallel lives, not particularly being prejudiced against each other, just not engaging one another. Social scientists say this is not an optimal situation. It is not a situation which expresses social cohesion. Social cohesion is a situation where people from different communities have positive relationships with one another. It's better for the peace, the stability, and the strength of a civil society. Social cohesion is reason number two for bridges of interfaith cooperation being a benefit. Reason number three, social capital. The famous Harvard social scientist Robert Putnam tells us that the single largest repository of social capital in the United States of America are our religious communities. That's where our civic energy, our volunteerism, our philanthropy comes from. Over 50%, Putnam says, of philanthropy, volunteerism, energy for voter registration drives, and blood banks, and disaster relief efforts is somehow related to religious communities. If we can bridge those religious communities in those kind of efforts, you have an opportunity to multiply the social capital within a society. Let me give you an interesting example of this. So I spend a lot of time on college campuses, and one of the things that I like to do when I'm on a campus is go visit with the volunteer coordinator. And I often ask he or she, tell me about the involvement of different religious groups in your volunteer efforts. And she will often say to me, they are our most involved groups. She'll open up her calendar and say, at 10 o'clock on Tuesday morning, I have a meeting with the Muslim Students Association Social Action Chair, who's going to come to me to talk about their second semester service project. And then on Thursday at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, I have a meeting with the Hillel, the Jewish Students Association Social Action Chair, who's going to come to talk to me about their monthly volunteer effort, and then the next week, a meeting with the Evangelical Volunteer Chair. And as she's looking at this, and I'm looking at her, a light bulb goes off in both of our minds, which is, why are these separate volunteer efforts? Why not think about involving the Jewish, Muslim, mainline Protestant, Catholic, Buddhist, Evangelical, Religious Students Association in joint interfaith volunteer efforts? You have more people giving blood to the blood drive. You have more people involved in the disaster relief effort. You have more food and money and clothing collected for a poverty alleviation drive in a city. And in addition to that multiplied social capital, that volunteer effort serves as an opportunity to build the bridges of cooperation that reduce prejudice and build social cohesion, right? And so, in a way, these bridges of cooperation, they accomplish all of these things together. Reduce prejudice, strengthen social cohesion, multiply social capital. if you are looking at me thinking, well, is this what you got your doctorate in? Because it seems pretty obvious to me, you are right. Part of what social scientists do is prove things that everybody else knows in their gut. But every once in a while, social scientists come up with something that is truly creative, because when you run the numbers, sometimes it doesn't just prove common sense, it actually reveals something that would otherwise be hard to know. That's the fourth thing here. Bridges of interfaith cooperation strengthen particular identity communities. Bridges of interfaith cooperation strengthen particular identity communities. The social scientist that I want to cite here is Christian Smith. Previously at the University of North Carolina, now at the University of Notre Dame. He ran something called the National Study on Youth and Religion, the largest collection of data that was looking at young people's relationship to religion, largely between the ages of 13 to 22. In the first publication that came out from that massive study, and it's produced multiple books, the first publication is called Soul Searching. And in that book, Christian Smith reveals something that ought to be frankly scary for any involved religious person in the United States of America, anybody who cares about the continuity of his or her religious community. He says that his great fear is not with unchurched Christian young people. It is with churched Christian young people. Because even those who go to church do not seem to know very much about their religion. And Christian Smith says, look, you talk to these 15-year-old kids who go to church, and they're eloquent about unbelievable things, about novels and movies and where they want to go to college and the careers they want to pursue. But you ask them anything deeper than the skin about Christianity, and they can't really tell you. They are theologically inarticulate. I'm just going to grab some water. Why is that? What does it have to do with bridges of interfaith cooperation? In a remarkable final 7 pages to the book, something that Christian Smith calls a concluding unscientific postscript, right? This is Christian Smith speaking as an active member of a church, now the Catholic Church. He was a recent convert, and not as a sociologist, right? He says that he believes the reason that churched young people are theologically inarticulate is because mainstream churches in the United States of America, with the exception of the Mormon community, the Latter-day Saints community, have not developed effectively a theology of interfaith cooperation. They want it both ways. They want to both be Christian and be respectful of diversity, but they have not found a way to put both of those on the table at the same time. In other words, they're kids who spend 2 hours a week in church and 198 hours a week in the world of religiously diverse America do not have a way of intersecting those two lives. So when they're around their Buddhist and Hindu and agnostic and Muslim friends, they do not have a language that is relevant to their religiously diverse lives that would have them think to themselves, I am proud to be a Christian in this world. The loudest voices, the loudest Christian voices, and by the way, this is the case in Islam and Judaism and every other religion as well, but the loudest Christian voices who speak directly of diversity are the ones building barriers of division. And they don't want that, obviously. But there are few prominent, loud, accessible Christian voices that speak of a Christian approach to religious diversity. So, if they have a choice between the barrier of division approach of being Christian and the blasé approach of hanging out with their diverse friends and really being nothing at all, they choose number 2. Christian Smith gave a name for it. The name is moralistic therapeutic deism. And he says to all the Christian parents in America, I have news for you. Your kids are not really Christian. They're moralistic, therapeutic deists. There's worse things to be in the world. What's a moralistic, therapeutic deism? Well, deism is we think God exists. Therapeutic, we want God to believe that we are good people. Moralistic, it's important to be a good person, right? Moralistic, therapeutic deism. We think God exists, we believe God wants us to be good, and if we believe that God wants us to be good and we are good, that makes us feel good. Moralistic, therapeutic deism. Why do Bridges of Interfaith Cooperation engage here? Because if you know the story of Dietrich Bonhoeffer and the Jews in Germany, because if you know the friendship between Martin Luther King Jr. and Thich Nhat Hanh and Abraham Joshua Heschel and A. Philip Randolph and Bayard Rustin, all non-Christians, right? If you have a language that connects your Christian tradition to the world of religious diversity around you, if you are able to place the bricks of theology into a line that would build a bridge of interfaith cooperation, you have a much better chance of remaining Christian. In this way, it just makes common sense. If you only spend 2 hours a week at church, or 5 hours a week with a biblical text, and 195 hours a week in a world of religious diversity, and if you don't have a way of connecting the Christian tradition to that world of diversity, which one loses? Which muscle atrophies? The one that you don't use very much. So the world of religious diversity is not going away. The only way to make it go away is to build a bunker or a barrier, right? That's why those communities do that, because they believe in order to remain pure in their tradition, they have to wall off the world of religious diversity. But there is another option, which is to say engagement in religious diversity is holy. It's sacred. It is, in fact, a Christian thing to do. But in order to do that, you have to actually know those dimensions of Christianity. You actually have to have the theological muscles of a bridge of interfaith cooperation. That's the part I want to get into right now. One of the interesting things about bunker, barrier, bludgeon, bridge is none of these things are naturally occurring in the world. None of these things are made by God, so to speak. They don't fall from the sky, they don't rise from the ground, they don't appear magically out of our oceans or burst forth like flowers from our trees. People build them. These are man-made things. Every time somebody shoots somebody else to the soundtrack of prayer out there in the world, they pulled the trigger of the gun. They did that. Every time somebody smashes somebody with the brick as a bludgeon of domination, they chose to do that. It's the same when it comes to bridges. If we want bridges of cooperation to characterize our interfaith relations, we're going to have to build them. And in order to build them, we're going to have a knowledge base, the raw material of those bridges. I want to talk about two key dimensions of this knowledge base. I want to talk about a history of interfaith cooperation, and I want to talk about a theology of interfaith cooperation. Theology, of course, speaks directly to the dimension that I spoke about, the fourth thing that I spoke about in the list of goods or benefits that come from bridges of cooperation, the continuity of identity communities. But let me begin with history. In 1999, I was in Cape Town, South Africa, at the Parliament of the World's Religions. And the kind of key event of that week was Mandela speaking. And he approaches the podium, and a man in the back stands up and he starts to sing a Xhosa praise song. Xhosa is the tribe that Mandela is from. And Mandela kind of cocks his head to the side and takes in this song, lets the waves wash over him. And it's this regal, beautiful, grand moment. And as that song kind of quietly fades away, Mandela points out into the Cape in the direction of Robben Island and says, I spent 27 years of my life in that jail, and I would still be there if it were not for the efforts of Muslims and Christians of Hindus and Jews, of African traditionalists and Baha'is and humanists in South Africa in the struggle against apartheid. And I had this sudden, inspiring, and slightly embarrassing realization that the struggle against apartheid was an interfaith movement. Why is it a little embarrassing? Because I was 25 years old and I had never thought of that before. I didn't realize that one of the great social movements of the 20th century was a movement built by people from different religions who were inspired by their prayers to do superhuman things, inspired by their theology to come together with one another, inspired in a way that crumbled apartheid. And then I started looking at different social movements in the 20th century through that lens. And it turns out that civil rights in the United States of America was an interfaith movement, beautifully expressed in the film Selma, by the way. We all know the great African American Baptist energy of that movement. But the film shows us these brief intimations of the interfaith dimensions. James Reeb, the Unitarian Universalist minister who comes from Boston, answering King's call, who, by the way, is assassinated in Selma. Abraham Joshua Heschel, who missed the trains going from Warsaw to Auschwitz by 6 weeks, comes from the Upper West Side of New York, where he teaches at the Jewish Theological Seminary, to march alongside King. Later says that it felt like his legs were praying. Dan Berrigan, the great Jesuit priest, and priests from 50 dioceses come to Selma. Berrigan gives this speech where he says, "Where's the church? Is it the bricks and mortar from where we came, or is it here in the streets of Selma? Catholics and Jews and Unitarians, African American Baptists, a post-Hajj Malcolm X, 3 weeks before its assassination at the Audubon Ballroom in New York, comes to Selma, gives a beautiful speech on really his version of the beloved community a couple weeks before the Selma March. Right? Selma is an interfaith movement, and if you click out a little bit more, you see King's life as an interfaith movement. 1950, hearing Mordecai Johnson talk about Christian love using the example of Gandhi, right? Applying Gandhi in 1955 in Montgomery, Alabama, going to India in 1959, seeing the interfaith nature of Gandhi's Hind Swaraj movement, coming back to his pulpit in Montgomery, Alabama, on Palm Sunday, 1959, saying, "Oh God, our gracious Heavenly Father, we call you this name. We know some call you Allah. We know some call you Brahma. We know some call you Elohim. We know some call you the unmoved mover." History is replete with these inspiring interfaith examples. And yet, the people who own the day seem to be the ones saying that people from different religions have only ever always killed each other and they only ever always will. Well, they are wrong. But if you don't have an alternative knowledge base, if you don't know that the struggle in South Africa, the Hind Swaraj movement, civil rights were all interfaith movements, and that's just the tip of the iceberg. That's just the 20th century, and not even the whole century. The people who say that the clash of civilizations is inevitable win. A big part of what interfaith leaders have in order to build a bridge of interfaith cooperation is the raw materials of that knowledge base, the history of interfaith cooperation. Second thing, theology of interfaith cooperation, which, as I said, is not just important for the civic importance of the interfaith bridge, not just important for the social cohesion and the social capital and the reduced prejudice, but is also extremely important for the continuity of your particular identity community, ELCA or Presbyterian or Methodist or Catholic or Mormon, whatever it is. If you are not able to theologically, positively engage with religious diversity, the chance of moralistic therapeutic deism is always at hand. What is a theology of interfaith cooperation? Very simply, it is the notion that positively engaging with religious diversity is sacred. It's holy, it comes from the text, it comes from the tradition. When you are greeting a Muslim nicely, it is not just because you are a nice person, it is because you are a Christian. It is theologically necessary. Now, in order to say this, one has to, of course, know that dimension of the tradition. Is it the only dimension? Of course not. Any tradition that's 2,000 years old or 1,400 years old or 5,000 years old has many dimensions. The question is, are you able to connect the dots of a relational religion from your tradition in a way that can reasonably be called a theology? Right? By the way, we are not by far the first generation to do this. Many, many generations past have done this. I think what's important for our generation is we're the first generation where this has to become a norm, right? Just like bar mitzvahs are a norm, just like getting confirmed is a norm. If you live in a religiously diverse world, a theology of interfaith cooperation has to be something you are raised with. It has to be something you are fluent in by age 13 or 14. People say to me all the time, so when should I introduce my kid to religious diversity? I'm like, well, unless you can show me the cave you have been living in, your kid knows religious diversity, right? He or she was probably born in a hospital with physicians, nurses, pediatricians, and administrators from 6 different religions, literally born into a situation of religious diversity. So your task is to teach them an understanding of Christianity or Judaism or Islam that views that religious diversity as something holy to engage in as a Christian or as a Muslim. I'm going to tell you 2 stories. I'm going to tell you a Christian story, and I'm going to tell you a Muslim story. When I say theology, I do not only mean exegesis. Now, clearly that's important. Clearly, interpretations of central texts matter. But our traditions are larger than text. Our traditions include art and architecture. They include poetry and philosophy. They include great moments in history and great people. So I want to tell you stories of great people who I think both embody and reveal a theology of interfaith cooperation. I'm going to start with the Christian example, Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, right? Born to German aristocratic parents, decides to become a pastor. His father says to him, the church is a boring institution when he's like 11 years old. He says, well, then I will change it. Comes to study at Union Theological Seminary, catches something of the social gospel movement in Adam Clayton Powell's church in Harlem, returns to Germany just as Hitler is starting to rise, and watches this happen with increasing alarm, especially the acquiescence of Christian churches. And in one particular moment of brutality, Nazis destroying property in Jewish neighborhoods, Bonhoeffer gets on German radio and speaks these words: "Those who did not stand up for the Jews do not deserve to sing Gregorian chants." Those who did not stand up for the Jews do not deserve to sing Gregorian chants. Right? That is a statement of Christian witness. What did Niebuhr say when Bonhoeffer was assassinated by the Nazis? His life belongs. He is gone with the apostles. His story is like that of the apostles. That is how close he was to the gospel. Those who did not stand up for the Jews do not deserve to sing Gregorian chants. There is a justice requirement that precedes the privilege of worship. Bonhoeffer does not go to his death for the Jews because he is a nice person. He goes to his death for the Jews in Nazi Germany because he is a Christian. Because it is a central part of his theology, a central part of his Christian witness. Interestingly, if you look back in the life of Bonhoeffer, now well documented by many, many people, you will see an awful lot of involvement in ecumenism. In fact, and beyond that as well, there's a time when Bonhoeffer wants to go visit Gandhi at his ashram in India, and he only changes that plan when he's called to lead the Finkenwald Seminary in Germany as part of the confessing church. Right? Bonhoeffer is both an embodiment and a revealer of a theology of interfaith cooperation within the Christian tradition. These are the figures we have to be fluent in order to build the theological dimension of that bridge. A Muslim example. So perhaps the central story in Islam is the story of Revelation in the year 610, right? As people know, the Prophet Muhammad, or at this time he's not prophet yet, Muhammad, a merchant in Mecca, would go up on a mountain outside of Mecca during the month of Ramadan. He would fast, he would give alms to the poor, he would pray. And on one of the odd nights of the last 10 days of the month of Ramadan in the year 610, a force grips Muhammad and says, "Iqra, recite." And Muhammad is afraid, and he says, "I am not a reciter." Right? Second time, the force grips him even tighter and says, "Recite." And Muhammad says again, "I am not a reciter." Muhammad is petrified. He thinks he's been perhaps invaded by a demon, by a jinn. Third time, the voice grips him where he feels like he's dying this time. The breath is being squeezed out of him. And instead, the first verses of the Quran come pouring from his lips. "Recite in the name of your Lord who created humankind from a clot of blood." There are traditions that say Muhammad was so scared he considered throwing himself off the mountain. And instead, he decides to confide in the person he loves and trusts and respects the most in the world, his wife, Khadija, who is 10, 15 years his senior and was the one who actually proposed marriage to him. And he runs, and Khadija covers him with a cloak, and he's trembling. And he says, "This force gripped me, and these words came out of my mouth. I think I've been possessed." And Khadija says, "I don't know what happened to you, but I know that God would never forsake anyone as righteous as you. We will go to my cousin, a man known as Waraka, my cousin who is learned in the scriptures. We will tell him what happened, and he will interpret it for us." So Khadija brings her husband Muhammad to Waraka, tells the story. Waraka looks Muhammad in the eyes, kisses him on the forehead, and says, "Verily, the prophet of your people has arrived." Who was Waraka? What does it mean to be learned in the scriptures in the early part of the 7th century in the western half of the Arabian Peninsula? Waraka was a Christian monk. The first person to recognize the coming of Islam and the prophethood of Muhammad was a Christian. A man who, incidentally, the sources indicate, never converts to Islam. Watches it from a respectful distance. Right? These are small stones in the theological bridge of interfaith cooperation. If they were the only stories, they wouldn't amount to a theology. If we didn't have the Muslim story of Abyssinia, with the Negus, a Christian king, protecting a small minority of Muslims who go there, if we didn't have the creation story in Islam, where God gives Adam the gift of naming the diversity of creation, if we didn't have verses like God made you nations and tribes that you may come to know one another, if we didn't have the good Samaritan story in Christianity. Who was the Samaritan? He was an other. But what kind of other? What do we learn from the story of the woman at the well? In the dispute that Jesus and the woman have, the Samaritans prayed at a different temple. What does it mean to be the other in the Good Samaritan story in Christianity? You were the religious other. The Samaritans were people who prayed to a different temple and in a different way than Jesus was guiding. If that is not an ethic and a theology of interfaith cooperation, a story, a stone in the bridge, if you will, I don't know what is. There is in all of these traditions a theology. All of these traditions contain all of these stones that you can piece together into a bridge. But if that's not a knowledge base that you and I are acquiring, if we are not looking in our traditions for that theology, then people who say that Christianity or Islam stand only for bunkers or barriers or bludgeons win. Their knowledge base wins. Not because the quarry, so to speak, of domination and division and isolation is larger just because they have collected more stones, just because they have more of those in their bag, so to speak. If you want to build bridges of interfaith cooperation, you're going to have these two parts of the knowledge base, a history and a theology. I want to end with this. I want to end with the fifth reason, as I promised you before, the fifth reason that interfaith cooperation matters for our civil society. It's because it's part of the sacred project of America. That's simple. Because so much of how we understand our country is as a sacred project. From the earliest descriptions in the Flushing Remonstrance, before this country was even a nation, from George Washington's letter to the Hebrew congregation of Newport, Rhode Island, from Lincoln, whose sesquicentennial we celebrate this year. I was at Gettysburg just a few months ago, right? Lincoln describes us as an almost chosen people. John Winthrop describes America as a city on a hill. Martin Luther King Jr. describes us as a beloved community. Jane Addams describes us as a cathedral of humanity. I don't want to lose that. I don't want to lose that poetry. I don't want to lose that sacredness. And by the way, I don't think that that particular intimation of American exceptionalism allows us to cover over our mistakes and crimes and even sins. I think what it does is it calls us to a higher level. That's why Lincoln calls us an almost chosen people, right? That's why it speaks in our founding documents of going towards a more perfect union. What does it mean to try to live up to that? I think interfaith cooperation is at the heart of that. I think it's been at the heart of it since before this land was a nation. Right? It's remarkable to look at what people at those points in history did. The Flushing Remonstrance, I think, being the signal moment of that. But especially now, in this moment of religious diversity and devotion at a time of global religious conflict and crisis and tension, we are going to need a new generation of interfaith bridge builders. So I leave you with this line from T.S. Eliot, which for me best sums up the project we are collectively involved in. He says that, we can't consider a tradition something that we inherit. So when we speak of the Parliament of the World's Religions and the Flushing Remonstrance and the letter to the Hebrew congregation of Newport, Rhode Island, and the interfaith nature of the civil rights movement, we don't simply wake up and own all of that. We don't just inherit it, right? A tradition is something we work to achieve. And I think a big part of the tradition of being an American is being an interfaith bridge builder. And I think that our generation, as much as any in the history of this country, needs to do its work to achieve that. Thank you.